Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The house was a fortress against the world. Highfields, it was called. A new stone mansion set deep within 400 acres of sour, wooded hills near Hopewell, New Jersey. It was built for privacy, a sanctuary from the ceaseless, suffocating glare of fame that followed its owner everywhere he went. And on the night of March 1, 1932, the world felt very far away. A cold, driving rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the bare trees with a lonely, mournful sound. Inside, a fire crackled. The most famous man on earth, Charles Augustus Lindbergh, was home. 5 years earlier, he had been a boyish airmail pilot from the Midwest. Then, in 33.5 hours, he flew a single-engine plane, the Spirit of St. Louis from New York to Paris, alone. He had conquered the Atlantic, and in doing so, he had conquered the imagination of the entire planet. He was no longer just a pilot. He was the lone eagle, an icon of courage, precision, and solitary grace. He had married Anne Morrow, the brilliant and poetic daughter of the American ambassador to Mexico. Herself and their firstborn son, Charles Jr., born in 1930, was not merely a child. He was the eaglet, an American prince, the focus of a national obsession. The house at Highfields was meant to be a normal place for this extraordinary family, a quiet haven where a little boy could grow up away from the flashbulbs and the adoring crowds. On that Tuesday night, the Lindberghs had finished a late supper. The baby, suffering from a cold, had been put to bed around 7:30 by his nurse, Betty Gow. At about 9 o'clock, Charles and Anne retired from the dining room to the living room, sitting together on a sofa for a few minutes before heading upstairs. Lindbergh sat at his desk in the corner of their bedroom, the wind rattling the window panes beside him. And then, at roughly 10 or 15 minutes past 9, he heard it, a sharp, distinct, cracking sound from somewhere outside to the southeast. It was peculiar enough that he commented on it to his wife. "What is that?" he asked. The sound, he would later testify, gave him the vague impression of something wooden and flimsy breaking. He pictured the top slats of an orange crate falling off a chair in the kitchen. It was a strange, domestic, and utterly trivial explanation for a sound that was anything but. It was a sound he would replay in his mind for the rest of his life, the sound of his world breaking apart. An hour passed. The house was quiet, save for the storm. At 10 o'clock, Betty Gow, the nurse, walked into the nursery to check on 20-month-old Charlie. The room was cold. The window was open. She went to the crib. It was empty. A wave of confusion, then panic. She hurried to Anne Lindbergh, who had just stepped out of her bath. "Mrs. Lindbergh, do you have the baby?" Anne said no. Gow then went to Charles. "Colonel Lindbergh, do you have the baby?" He was in his room, reading. He said no. For a fleeting, chilling moment, both women had the same thought. It was one of the colonel's practical jokes. He was known for them, sometimes unsettling ones. Months earlier, he had hidden his own son in a closet for over 30 minutes just to see his wife's frantic reaction. But as he saw the terror in their faces, he knew. "Anne," he said, his voice stripped of its usual calm authority, "they have stolen our baby." A frantic search of the house began. In the nursery, on the radiator cover beneath the open window, lay a plain white envelope. Lindbergh, careful not to touch it with his bare hands, used a letter opener to pry it open. Inside was a crudely written note, a jumble of misspellings and strange grammar. It read, "Dear Sir, have $50,000 ready, $25,000 in $20 bills, $15,000 in $10 bills, and $10,000 in $5 bills. After 24 days will inform you where to deliver the money. We warn you for making anything public or for notify the police. The child is in gut care. Indication for all letters are signature and 3 holds. The sound Charles Lindbergh heard was not a falling orange crate. It was the sound of a crudely built ladder breaking under the weight of a man and a child. It was the sound that would launch the greatest manhunt in American history. But this case is more than the story of a kidnapping. It is the story of a collision. Tonight, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the dual anatomy of the Lindbergh case, the birth of modern forensic science, where truth was found in the grain of a single piece of wood, and the simultaneous birth of the modern media circus, where a verdict was rendered by millions before a trial ever began. To understand the explosion that followed the discovery of that empty crib, you must first understand the sheer magnitude of the Lindbergh name in 1932. Charles Lindbergh was not just a celebrity in the way we understand it today. He was a global phenomenon, a figure of mythic proportions. His 1927 flight had been more than a record. It was a spiritual event for a world weary of war and cynicism. He represented individualism, technological mastery, and a quiet, heroic modesty. He received millions of letters, was mobbed in every city he visited, and his face was on the cover of every magazine. When he married Anne Morrow Lindbergh, it was the union of American royalty. She was not merely a wife, but a partner, a gifted pilot who served as his co-pilot and navigator on pioneering flights across the globe. Their son, Charles Jr., was therefore the heir to this legend, a child whose every photograph was a national event. The kidnapping was not just a crime against a family. It was perceived as a sacrilegious act, an attack on America's most cherished icon. It was, from the very first headline, the crime of the century. This immense public profile, the very thing the Lindberghs had built Highfields to escape, now became the engine of the chaos that consumed the investigation. Within an hour of the discovery, Lindbergh had called the local Hopewell police chief. Soon after, the New Jersey State Police, under the command of Colonel H. Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., father of the future Gulf War general, arrived and took charge. But they were not alone. The news, transmitted by the new magic of radio and telegraph, spread like wildfire. By morning, the isolated estate was under siege. A swarm of reporters, photographers, and morbidly curious sightseers descended upon Highfields. They trampled the muddy grounds, obliterating the very footprints the police were trying to preserve. They contaminated the scene with cigarette butts and discarded paper. One enterprising group of news photographers denied access at the gate, rented an ambulance, posed as medics, and drove right onto the property, setting up a portable darkroom to develop their pictures on site. Any evidence not immediately collected by the overwhelmed officers in those first few hours was lost forever in the mire of the media stampede. The initial forensic efforts were, by modern standards, primitive. Investigators examined the ransom note and the homemade ladder found beneath the nursery window, but found no usable fingerprints. The immediate conclusion was that the kidnapper, or kidnappers, had worn gloves and perhaps even covered their shoes. In the face of this external chaos, Charles Lindbergh did what he had always done. He sought to impose control. A man defined by meticulous planning and self-reliance, he could not abide sitting by as a passive victim. He grabbed his rifle and searched the grounds himself. He made it unequivocally clear to Colonel Schwarzkopf that while the police could conduct their investigation, he, Charles Lindbergh, would personally handle all negotiations with the kidnappers. This decision, born of a desperate need to reclaim agency in a situation of ultimate powerlessness, would have profound consequences. It effectively created a shadow investigation, running parallel to the official one. Lindbergh used his connections to reach out to underworld figures, including Al Capone, who offered his help from a prison cell. He believed that organized crime had a better network for finding the baby than the police did. This created immediate and lasting friction with law enforcement. J. Edgar Hoover, the ambitious young director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, offered his agency's resources, but was large. The investigation became a fractured, disorganized affair, with multiple parties pursuing different leads, often without sharing information. Lindbergh's attempt to control the uncontrollable only sowed more confusion. The media, in these early days, was a deeply paradoxical force. Its practitioners were a destructive presence, turning a crime scene into a carnival. Yet they also became an indispensable, if unruly, tool of the investigation itself. The kidnapper's own notes often demanded communication through newspaper advertisements. The entire nation was watching, and the press became the public square where the drama played out. The Lindberghs, though intensely private, understood this. In a move that demonstrated their desperation, they authorized the release of their own home movies of Charlie to newsreel companies. Within 24 hours, the flickering images of the little boy playing in the sun were being shown in movie theaters across the country. It was the first mass media Amber Alert, an appeal to a nation of millions to become deputized investigators. The media was no longer just reporting the story. It had become a central character in it, a public bulletin board for a desperate father and a taunting criminal, a dangerous and unprecedented fusion of journalism and investigation. For a week, there was silence. The world waited. Then, on March 6th, a new ransom letter arrived at Highfields, postmarked from Brooklyn. It carried the same strange, interlocking circle symbol as the first. The demand was now raised to $70,000. The chaos of the investigation deepened, with cranks and con artists offering false leads. Then, an unlikely figure stepped out of the crowd and into the center of the case. His name was Dr. John F. Condon, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher and local eccentric from the Bronx. He was a patriot, a lover of Shakespeare, and a man who saw himself as a public servant. On March 8th, he wrote a letter to his local paper, the Bronx Home News, offering $1,000 of his own money as an additional reward and volunteering his services as an intermediary. To the astonishment of everyone, especially the police, it worked. The very next day, Condon received a letter in the mail. It bore the kidnapper's symbol and accepted his offer. Lindbergh, desperate for any credible contact, agreed to let Condon proceed. Condon adopted a pseudonym based on the phonetic sound of his initials. JFC. He became JFC. What followed was one of the strangest chapters in American criminal history. JFC, the elderly academic, began a series of clandestine negotiations with a man he would come to call Cemetery John. Their first meeting was arranged via newspaper ads and took place on the night of March 12th, under the cover of darkness, in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Condon waited nervously among the tombstones until a figure emerged from the shadows. The man's face was partially obscured by a handkerchief, and he spoke with a thick German accent. He was cautious, telling Condon, "I am only a go-between." Condon, ever the educator, demanded proof that the kidnappers actually had the child. The man promised to send it. A few days later, a package arrived at Condon's home. Inside was a small, gray flannel sleeping suit. It was the one Charles Jr. had been wearing on the night he was taken. Anne Lindbergh confirmed its identity. The contact was real. The negotiations intensified, culminating in a second cemetery meeting, this time at St. Raymond's Cemetery, also in the Bronx, on the night of April 2, 1932. This was to be the night of the ransom exchange. Lindbergh himself was there, a hidden participant in the drama. He drove Condon to a florist's shop near the cemetery, where Condon picked up a specially made wooden box containing $50,000, much of it in gold certificates whose serial numbers had been painstakingly recorded by the Treasury Department. Lindbergh then parked his car on a dark street bordering the cemetery, waiting, listening. Condon went in alone. He met the man again, the mysterious John. As they spoke, Lindbergh heard a voice call out from the darkness, "Hey, doctor." It was a voice he would claim, years later, that he never forgot. Condon handed over the box of money. In return, the man gave him a note. It contained the instructions for finding the child. The man melted back into the shadows and was gone. Condon rushed back to the car. He and Lindbergh read the note with trembling hands. It claimed the baby was safe and could be found on a boat named the Nellie, located in the waters off the coast of Massachusetts, near Martha's Vineyard. Hope surged. Lindbergh, the master aviator, immediately began planning a flight, a desperate rescue mission. But the hope was a cruel illusion. An exhaustive search of the coastline revealed no such boat. The Nellie did not exist. The note was a final, heartless deception. The $50,000 was gone, and so was their son. The weeks that followed were an agony of silence and false hope. The nation held its breath. Then, on May 12, 72 days after the kidnapping, the waiting ended in the most brutal way imaginable. A delivery truck driver named Orville Wilson and his assistant, William Allen, pulled over on the side of a road near Mount Rose, New Jersey, just 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh estate. Allen walked about 45 feet into the woods to relieve himself. There, in a shallow makeshift grave, partly buried under leaves and debris, he saw it. The badly decomposed body of a toddler. The remains were horrifying. The skull was massively fractured, with a distinct hole in it. Some of the limbs were missing. The local coroner would determine that the child had been dead for about 2 months. Killed by a powerful blow to the head, he had likely died on the very night he was taken from his crib. Charles Lindbergh was called to the morgue in Trenton. He identified the body of his son by a distinctive overlap of his toes and the shirt he was wearing. The crime was no longer kidnapping for ransom. It was murder. With the discovery of the child's body, the character of the investigation shifted. The frantic, public search for a living boy gave way to the slow, methodical, and often invisible hunt for a killer. The chaos of the initial response, with its contaminated crime scene and competing investigators, began to coalesce around a new and powerful force: forensic science. The case against the man who would eventually be arrested was not built on a single confession or a dramatic eyewitness account. It was constructed piece by piece in quiet laboratories and workshops by a new breed of scientific detective who found truth not in human testimony, but in the silent, immutable language of physical evidence. We will now dissect the 3 pillars of that evidence: a piece of wood, a sample of handwriting, and a trail of gold. Our first subject is the ladder. The crude 3-section ladder found abandoned under the nursery window was one of the few tangible pieces of evidence from the crime scene. To the untrained eye, it was a piece of junk, clumsily nailed together, but to Arthur Kohler, it was a story waiting to be told. Kohler was a wood technologist at the United States Forest Products Laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin. He was not a policeman. He was a scientist, one of the foremost experts in the world on the structure and properties of wood. In 1933, the New Jersey State Police, their investigation now cold for over a year, sent him the ladder. Kohler's work would become a landmark in the history of forensics. He began by disassembling the ladder, numbering every single piece. He identified 4 different types of wood used in its construction: North Carolina pine, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and birch. The mix of woods suggested it was built from scrap lumber, not from materials bought for the purpose. Some pieces were old and weathered, others were new. The workmanship, he noted, was poor. But Kohler's genius was in seeing what others could not. He focused on the machine-planed surfaces of the North Carolina pine rails. He knew that as lumber passes through a planer, the spinning blades leave behind a unique pattern of microscopic grooves and ridges, a mechanical fingerprint that changes as the knives dull or are nicked. Using a powerful magnifying glass and carefully angled light, Kohler was able to identify this unique signature on the ladder's wood. He then embarked on an exhaustive 18-month quest. He wrote to hundreds of lumber mills across the country, requesting samples of their planing work. He traveled thousands of miles, visiting mill after mill, comparing their blades' signatures to the marks on the ladder. Finally, in a mill in South Carolina, he found a match. He then traced shipments from that mill and discovered that a load of that specific lumber had been sent to the National Lumber and Millwork Company in the Bronx, New York. The police now had a geographic starting point, a neighborhood to focus on, long before they had a suspect. But Kohler's most astonishing discovery was yet to come. It centered on one specific piece of the ladder, a side rail he had labeled Rail 16. It was made of North Carolina pine, and it had a distinctive grain pattern and 4 square nail holes in it. The holes were old. The nails had been pulled out after the arrest of a German carpenter from the Bronx named Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Investigators searched his home. In his attic, they found that a section of the floorboards was missing. They sent the remaining attic floorboards to Arthur Kohler. In his laboratory, Kohler placed Rail 16 next to one of the boards from Hauptmann's attic. The evidence he presented in court was stunning and irrefutable. The annual growth rings, the lines that mark a tree's yearly growth, flowed perfectly from the attic board into Rail 16. They were, without question, once part of the same single piece of wood. Furthermore, the 4 square nail holes in Rail 16 lined up exactly with the nail holes in the wooden joists of Hauptmann's attic floor. Kohler had not only traced the ladder's wood to a lumberyard near Hauptmann's home, he had traced a piece of the ladder itself directly into Hauptmann's house. As a final devastating point, he examined the hand plane found in Hauptmann's tool collection. He demonstrated to the jury that the tiny, unique nicks in its blade matched the tool marks on the edges of the ladder's rungs. The ladder, the central tool of the crime, was now inextricably linked to Bruno Hauptmann. The second pillar of the scientific case was built on ink and paper. The kidnapper had sent a total of 15 ransom notes. While the handwriting was clearly disguised, a group of 8 of the nation's top document examiners, led by the venerable Albert S. Osborne, believed the notes contained a wealth of subconscious tells. They analyzed the letters for months, building a detailed psychological and national profile of the author. They concluded unanimously that all 15 notes were written by the same person. They also concluded that the writer was a native German speaker who had learned to write English as an adult. The evidence for this was in the very structure of the writing. There were Germanic sentence constructions and numerous phonetic misspellings that a native English speaker would be unlikely to make. Words like good were spelled goot, anything became anything, and money was money. The writer also had a host of peculiar, individual habits. The letter O was often left open at the top. The letter X was formed like 2 E's pushed together. The capital N was often written backwards, and most famously, the word signature was consistently misspelled as signature. When Bruno Hauptmann was arrested, he was forced to provide extensive handwriting samples. He was told to write what the police dictated, and at one point was even told to copy the ransom notes themselves, a controversial and highly questionable police tactic. Hauptmann tried to disguise his writing, but the experts testified that his attempts at disguise were futile. His subconscious habits, they argued, were impossible to suppress. They pointed to dozens of similarities. Hauptmann, like the note writer, misspelled boat as boad. He wrote our as our. He used the same oddly formed letters. The experts presented the jury with massive photographic enlargements, showing words from the ransom notes side by side with words from Hauptmann's known writing. The similarities were, they argued, as conclusive as a fingerprint. The voice of the kidnapper, heard only as a German-accented whisper in a dark cemetery, now had a corresponding and equally German signature in ink. The third and final pillar of the forensic case was the money itself. The decision to pay the $50,000 ransom in gold certificates proved to be a stroke of investigative genius, amplified by a stroke of pure luck. Gold certificates were a form of paper currency that, as the name implies, were redeemable for a fixed amount of gold. The Treasury Department meticulously recorded the serial number of every single bill given to the kidnapper. Then, in April of 1933, a year after the ransom was paid, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in a bid to combat the Great Depression, issued Executive Order 6102. The order took the United States off the gold standard and made it illegal for private citizens to hoard gold certificates. All such bills were to be turned into the Treasury by May 1, 1933, in exchange for regular currency. Overnight, the $40,000 in gold certificates from the ransom payment became radioactive. Anyone spending them would immediately draw suspicion. For more than 2 years, the bills surfaced in a slow, steady trickle. A $10 bill here, a $20 bill there. Investigators from the NYPD, the New Jersey State Police, and the FBI painstakingly tracked each one. They interviewed every shopkeeper and bank teller who received one. And as they did, a pattern emerged. They began sticking pins in a map of New York City. The vast majority of the pins clustered in 2 areas: Upper Manhattan, particularly the German neighborhood of Yorkville, and the Bronx. The net was slowly, methodically closing. The final breakthrough came on a Saturday afternoon, September 15, 1934. A man driving a dark blue Dodge sedan pulled into a Warner Quinlan gas station on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. He bought 5 gallons of gas and paid the attendant, Walter Lyle, with a $10 gold certificate. Lyle was immediately suspicious. His company had warned about counterfeit gold notes. As the car pulled away, Lyle, acting on a hunch, scribbled the car's New York license plate number on the margin of the bill, 4U1341. 3 days later, that bill was deposited at a local bank. An alert teller checked the serial number against the list provided by the FBI. It was a match. Investigators traced the license plate. It was registered to a man named Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant carpenter who lived at 1279 East 222nd Street in the Bronx. The anonymous profile, built from wood grains and misspelled words, finally had a name. The convergence of these 3 distinct lines of investigation, the high-level science of wood anatomy, the methodical expertise of handwriting analysis, and the old-fashioned shoe-leather police work of tracking currency, all capped by a lucky break from an observant citizen, was a landmark moment. It demonstrated that modern criminal investigation was not about a single magic bullet, but about the painstaking weaving together of disparate threads into an unbreakable rope. On September 19, 1934, after days of intense surveillance, police and federal agents moved in. They spotted Bruno Richard Hauptmann leaving his home and followed his car. When he realized he was being watched, he tried to flee, speeding through city streets until he was blocked by a truck and forced to surrender. In his wallet, they found a $20 gold certificate from the ransom money. The arrest was just the beginning. A search of Hauptmann's home and garage uncovered a mountain of damning evidence. Hidden inside a dirty gas can, stuffed into drilled-out blocks of wood, and buried in an earthenware jar under the garage floor, investigators found nearly $15,000 more of the Lindbergh ransom money. And in a discovery that seemed to seal his fate, they found, scrawled in pencil on the inside of a closet door frame in his kitchen, the telephone number and address of the intermediary, Dr. John F. Condon. Hauptmann's explanation was that he was merely holding the money for a friend and business partner, a man named Isidor Fisch, who had since returned to Germany and died of tuberculosis. He claimed Fisch had left a shoebox with him containing the money, and he had only just discovered it. It was a story that few believed. The trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann began on January 2, 1935. It did not take place in a major city, but in the small, rural county seat of Flemington, New Jersey. For the next 5 weeks, this quiet town was transformed into the epicenter of a global media event. The trial was a spectacle unlike any America had ever seen. 60,000 people descended on Flemington. The courthouse was besieged by hundreds of reporters, including the biggest names in journalism: Damon Runyon, Walter Lippmann, the gossip columnist Walter Winchell. Telegraph and telephone lines were strung directly from the courtroom to newsrooms around the world, transmitting every word of testimony in real time. Hollywood movie stars and society matrons filled the public gallery. It was the birth of the modern trial of the century, a legal proceeding that was simultaneously a piece of mass entertainment, a national obsession broadcast live to an enthralled public. Inside the courtroom, the legal battle was a study in contrasts. The prosecution was led by New Jersey's ambitious Attorney General, David T. Wilentz. At 38, Wilentz was a political appointee who had never before tried a criminal case. But he was a brilliant and ruthless strategist. He understood the power of narrative and methodically built his case on the pillars of the forensic evidence, weaving them together into a story of overwhelming circumstantial guilt. He presented the wood evidence from Arthur Kohler, the handwriting analysis from Albert Osborne, and the trail of the ransom money. Hauptmann's defense was helmed by Edward J. Riley, a flamboyant, 52-year-old attorney from Brooklyn. Known as Big Ed and the Bull of Brooklyn, Riley had a reputation as a formidable courtroom brawler who claimed to have won acquittals for most of his 2,000 clients. But by 1935, his best days were behind him. His defense strategy was thin and often chaotic. He stuck to the Isidor Fisch story, trying to portray his client as the gullible victim of a deceased but he was unable to produce credible witnesses to support his claims, and Wilentz's relentless cross-examinations often left the defense looking unprepared and foolish. The trial was defined by moments of high drama, amplified and broadcast by the media circus outside. The testimony of Charles Lindbergh was the trial's pivotal event. The national hero took the stand and, in a quiet but firm voice, did something he had previously told investigators he could not do. He identified Bruno Hauptmann's voice. He testified that as he sat in his car outside St. Raymond's Cemetery on the night of the ransom payment, He had heard the man known as John call out, and that the voice he heard was the voice of the man now sitting in the defendant's chair. This single moment, the hero pointing his finger at the accused, was devastating. It electrified the public and solidified in the minds of millions that Hauptmann was guilty. The media's role in shaping this perception was profound. Newsreel cameras, which the judge had permitted under strict rules, were sometimes used surreptitiously to capture the most dramatic moments of testimony. For the first time, Americans didn't just read about a trial, they saw and heard it in their local movie theaters. The line between a legal proceeding, bound by rules of evidence, and a public drama, driven by emotion and spectacle, had been irrevocably blurred. Hauptmann was being tried simultaneously in two courts, one in Flemington and one in the court of public opinion. After 5 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for 11 hours. On February 13, 1935, they returned with their verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. The mandatory sentence was death. Bruno Hauptmann's appeals, which went all the way to the Supreme Court, were denied. His requests for clemency were rejected. He spent his final days in Trenton State Prison, continuing to maintain his innocence, refusing offers of a life sentence in exchange for a confession. On the evening of April 3, 1936, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was led to the electric chair. He gave no final statement. At 8:47 p.m., he was pronounced dead. In the end, the Lindbergh case stands as a monument to a fundamental conflict in the pursuit of justice, a conflict born in the 1930s that echoes to this day. It is a story with a dual anatomy. The first is the anatomy of modern forensics. The case was a powerful validation of scientific evidence. The revolutionary work of men like Arthur Koehler proved that in the absence of a confession or a clear eyewitness, science could forge an unbreakable chain of logic from a crime scene to a suspect. The meticulous analysis of wood grain, tool marks, and handwriting established a new standard for criminal investigation. It gave immense credibility to the scientific methods of J. Edgar Hoover's fledgling FBI and professionalized police work across the country. It demonstrated that truth could be found in the quiet, patient examination of things, not just people. But the second competing anatomy is that of the modern media spectacle. The case unleashed the terrifying power of trial by media. The relentless, sensationalized, and often reckless coverage created an atmosphere of such intense public pressure that a truly impartial trial was arguably impossible. The public was no longer a passive observer of the justice system. It was an active, emotional participant, consuming testimony as daily entertainment and forming a collective judgment long before the jury did. The case's most immediate legal legacy was the Federal Kidnapping Act of 1932, universally known as the Lindbergh Law. Spurred by the national outrage, Congress made kidnapping a federal crime if the victim was transported across state lines, a change that vastly expanded the jurisdiction and power of the FBI. The enduring controversies, the alternative theories that continue to swirl around the case, blaming the Lindbergh staff, or even Lindbergh himself, are not just the product of an unsolved mystery. They are the direct consequence of the case's chaotic beginnings, the public's distrust sown by the media circus, and the complex, sometimes troubling character of Charles Lindbergh himself. Bruno Hauptmann was convicted by the grain of a wooden ladder and the ghost of a German accent in a dark cemetery, but he was also condemned by the flash of 1,000 cameras and the roar of 1,000,000 headlines. The enduring question of the Lindbergh case is not simply whether one man was guilty, but whether any man could have been proven innocent in the face of such a perfect storm of science and spectacle. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.